Could someone turn that light off? Jason, can you turn that light off for me? Just one of this, which is, pick that one. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Jason. All right, this week we will be reading about a major turning point in the book of Genesis, in the life, specifically in the life of Joseph. This is an important week for us to remember everything that happened beforehand. So this morning I have to spend a little extra time going over the narrative and going over the points of the narrative in Joseph's stories that we've been through. Because right in this week, everything is coming to an head, to a climax, to the turning point. So we need to remember a lot of the details because a lot of them will appear again in this chapter. So we've looked at 5 major blocks of his life, the way the story, the narrative has played out. They represent 5 stages. We learned the least amount from his childhood and birth, but he was a child of favor and a child of promise. And that ended with the death of his mother, which was sad. Then, at the age of 17, he was a prominent figure in his family, a man of authority. But that ended with his brother's hatred and jealousy, where they sold him into slavery. In slavery, God protected him and brought him to another position of authority in Potiphar's house. But that ended poorly, where he was falsely accused and put into prison. In prison, he was also given a position of authority, and he was also put into a specific position in time where he was able to interpret 2 dreams. And God gave him that interpretation, gave him those answers. And that was promising as far as the people with whom he interpreted it, because they were part of Pharaoh's court, and they could give a good word for Joseph to Pharaoh and possibly release him from prison. But that ended with them forgetting him, specifically the one cupbearer forgetting him. And then we saw, after that, at the age of 28, at the age of 30, 2 years later, we saw finally Pharaoh had a dream. And Joseph was removed from the house of the prison, the dungeon, and put into Pharaoh's house, where he is given a position of authority, great authority, and where he interpreted those 2 dreams for Pharaoh and became the person that was going to lead Egypt through these times. There was 7 years of plenty, where Joseph was in charge of storing up, and then there would be 7 years of famine, which Joseph would be in charge of distributing wisely to take the people through that difficult time. And in this time, when he's in the house of Pharaoh, God had blessed him with a position, with authority, with wealth, and then with a family, where he has now 2 sons of his own. And his life is so great that he has put his past behind him. All the troubles, everything that he's gone through, it was worth it. But God doesn't allow him to forget the unresolved issues with his family. So let's zoom into that last block, which is Joseph in the house of Pharaoh. The first story arc, God brings Joseph's brothers down to Egypt to actually see him. We have the first visit from the 10 brothers, where Joseph unexpectedly meets them when they come to buy grain. And they speak, and he disguises himself, and that first story ends with Joseph putting them all in prison for a couple of days. And he made a plan where they all can go stay in prison, and only one of them will go back and get their youngest brother. He's accused them of being spies, and this is the way that he has said that they can prove that they're not spies. Really, he just wants to see his brother. He wants to be reunited with his brother. Well, after 3 days, Joseph has had time to change his plan, and he sends them back, all of them back, and just keeps one of them. He keeps Simeon. And he goes back home, and he keeps Simeon in order to have security that they will indeed come back and bring Benjamin in order to get Simeon out. And Joseph knows the famine has just started, so there's 6 more years. They're going to come back anyway. So when they get home and the brothers tell everything to their father, the difficulty there at the end was the father refuses. He's too afraid to lose Benjamin. He's never going to, he says specifically, you're never going to take Benjamin again because something might happen to him. And he'd be in great sorrow and grief. But as time passes and his hunger sets in, Jacob realizes that he has to let Benjamin go for the sake of the whole family, for everyone. And he prays, may God Almighty, the El Shaddai, grant you, being plural, all the brothers, compassion in the sight of the man, so that he will release to you your other brother and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. He stops trying to have control, and he lets circumstances be in God's hands. He puts his trust in God and does what is right for the whole family. So when they return to Egypt, now there's 11 of them, where we see Joseph receives them, creates a banquet in his own home, and we finally see partially the 11 stars being bowed, but we don't see that second dream completely fulfilled yet. And they dine with Joseph, and specifically the text makes a connection with Jacob's prayer, and Joseph has compassion on Benjamin. He calls Benjamin his brother, his mother's son. He literally says, my son, out of Joseph. The text calls him his brother and his mother's son, but Joseph calls him my son, showing an affectionate term in a relationship, while the rest of them are still just men, or the man. In the last two chapters, we've seen the lack of family terms. The brothers are just identified as men, and Joseph is just the man. And there's a generic sense there. And with Benjamin coming back, that is broken in the narrative, and it's a contrast, and it shows that Joseph and Benjamin's relationship is there. They're reunited as brothers. Now, at the end of the dinner, we have a new problem. Well, the brothers are going to want to go back. They came back for grain to bring back to their families. Well, they were just reunited with his long-lost brother. How can he keep him? And that's what brings us to the chapter 44, where we saw two plans. First plan was Joseph's plan to keep Benjamin, to keep him down in Egypt under his care, under his protection. Now, in the first trip, Joseph returned the money secretly into the bags. In the second trip, when they're sending him back to do the same thing, but in Benjamin's sack, he puts his own personal silver cup as a security, so that when his people find it, he can bring him back, accuse him of theft, and keep him there in Egypt, and send the other brothers away. And he tries to do that, and he says, no, the guilty party will stay, the innocent will go, and we'll still be at peace with him, so that they can come back, continually come back, because the famine is still 5 more years, and buy food. And yet Joseph will secretly keep Benjamin. But what he doesn't expect is that his brothers, they are now all an actual family who love one another. And Judah and the others, they show unity and solidarity as a family. And they return back with Benjamin to Joseph's, ready to all suffer, to all be in it together. And when Judah comes back and speaks to Joseph, he recalls the events not fully known by Joseph about their history. And he speaks how their father would surely die of grief and be in great pain if Benjamin is not returned. Then Judah ends the chapter by saying, now therefore, please, let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how should I go up to my father if the lad is not with me? For fear that I see the evil that would overtake my father. Judah is willing to exchange his life, his freedom, his family, and his future in order to, number one, keep his word, his promise that he made to his father, and number two, in order not to cause any more pain to his father. He is acting out of sacrificial love for the good of his father. And this shows us the pinnacle of him becoming an honest and honorable man. And Joseph unexpectedly saw that, number one, these brothers, these guys are not the same men he knew 22 years ago. That God has worked in their lives and make them become an honorable men, honest men. And then number two, he did not expect that his plan to secretly keep Benjamin would unintentionally cause great sorrow and grief to his father, and possibly his death. To continue in that manner would be cruel and not honorable to his father. So by putting Joseph in this place, we see the Lord moving circumstances to force his servant Joseph to show loving mercy to all his brothers. At this moment in the narrative, we see God fully granting Jacob's prayer. And may the El Shaddai, the God who judges, who brings life and blessing or judgment and death, to you all, compassion in the sight of the man who was actually Joseph, so that he will release to you the other brother of Benjamin. And we talked about how that other brother is ambiguous. Why didn't he just say Simeon? The text is ambiguous because it's being applied into two different circumstances. Here, Jacob's prayer had already been fulfilled. Joseph had released both Benjamin and Simeon. But now Joseph is still disguising himself. He still has, and in that disguise and keeping himself from that relationship, he's in a prison of his own making. And here, God, we see in these circumstances, God is forcing Joseph to have compassion, have that loving mercy on his brothers by reintroducing himself to their lives. So Joseph is kept in his disguise, and he relates to his brothers. He has been as if they were strangers and at a distance, which is not the goal of forgiveness, of reconciliation, and peace. So here, God is answering Jacob's prayer by forcing Joseph to reveal himself. So now we're ready to look at truths uncovered. Genesis 45, verses 1 through 15. And this morning we're going to consider 4 truths uncovered by Joseph. Now the first truth that's revealed is Joseph reveals his identity, verses 1 through 3. Verse 1 and 2 say, "And Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, 'Have everyone go out from me.' So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it." So Joseph can't control himself anymore. So he sends all of his attendants, all of his servants out of the room. Remember, he's been speaking to his brothers through an interpreter. And he would always have guards and other people around him to do his every wish, every whim. He sends them all out, and in an emotional way. And then we hear from the perspective of those who went outside, they could hear him. They could hear him weeping. He was weeping that loudly. And news obviously traveled fast because that was also carried over to Pharaoh's house. And why was that? Well, because Joseph is the second in command of all of Egypt. If he's weeping, if there's something wrong and he's weeping that loudly, he's that emotionally disturbed, Pharaoh needs to know about it because that could affect his rule. But did you see the change? When I read this verse, did you see the break? This is the first time in 2 chapters the brothers are called brothers again. They're no longer men. Notice who the men are. Those are the ones that are non-family members that are pushed out of the room. And now, finally, Joseph, the narrative is communicating that there's about to be a reunification of the family. They are now becoming brothers again. So I want you to look. I'm not going to point them out, but in these next 15 verses that we're going to go over, there are 18 terms of family relationships. Father, son, and brothers, repeated 18 times. It's a huge emphasis on family, unity, restoration. So Joseph sends out the non-family members for privacy. So now he and his brothers could speak freely about their past without it becoming public knowledge. And they could speak freely. Now the brothers would be extremely nervous because Joseph abruptly orders his servants out. And verse 2 speaks of what was heard on the outside, which is a loud cry. So we know that there's crying and weeping about to happen. So now the narrative, the next verse, goes back on the inside. This, verse 2, he wept so loudly the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh also heard it. That is reporting from the outside what happened behind closed doors. Now, starting in verse 3, we go into that room and hear about the events that transpired. So, verse 3 says, Then Joseph said to the brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So now, it's important. Joseph, first thing he says is, I am Joseph. As far as we know, that name has never been spoken of to that Egyptian ruler. The brothers had never communicated that to them, to Joseph. So, from the brothers' perspective, this guy should know their lost brother's name. And he does. He says, I am Joseph. Where has he found that information out? Because surely this couldn't be Joseph. And then the next thing he says, which is fascinating, right? He doesn't go directly to their relationship. Where does he go? To his father. Is my father still alive? Now, this emphasis tells us this is the driving force behind Joseph revealing himself. It's his care and concern for his father. Why? Why would he ask about Jacob's welfare? Remember that Judah has just said that he had to send Benjamin back, or else his father would suffer and possibly even die of grief. So his father's still alive. They've already communicated that. The question that Joseph is asking is Jacob suffering now by having Benjamin down here? And how much is he really suffering? Is his life really at risk even now? Am I causing him pain and sorrow and suffering? And Joseph wants to hear the more intimate details about his father's welfare, more than what is going to be communicated to a stranger in polite conversation. And in order to do that, he has to reveal himself as a brother. But notice the brothers there, they can't answer him because they're dismayed at his presence. The brothers who are living in the dread of the moment, they can't speak a word. They don't know what to speak. They're shocked. The word for dismay is to be terrified, panic-stricken, to be horrified. It's often used in context of war where a soldier or a person is paralyzed by fear. That's the word. They would be all kinds of white, sheets of white. They'd be sweating and cold sweats. They're terrified. And it's understandable. This is the second most powerful man in the world. And they have acted quite wickedly to him in the past. Selling him into slavery. And since the time where they've known him, he's kept that identity secret until now. And so the question is, what will he do next? He's just removed everyone. He can do anything he wants to. So they're equally one part shocked and one part scared of the unknown. And thus they can't answer him. So Joseph, in acting out of compassion to his brothers, continues and he gives words of comfort. Verses 4 through 8. Now remember, Joseph has every advantage over his brothers who have wronged him. But he chooses to comfort them, to bring peace to them. Verse 4 says, Then Joseph said to his brothers, Please, come closer to me. And they came closer, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. So here we see Joseph speaking to them kindly. He's not ordering them. He says, please come in. It's a very welcoming, friendly language. And they come closer. They obey him. And he reveals further greater proof of his identity. He says, I am your brother, Joseph. So once again, it's before he just says, I'm Joseph. Now he's making it a little more clear, Joseph, that's your brother. And then number 2, I am the one whom you sold into Egypt, meaning into slavery. Now that's extremely important because out of the 11 brothers who were there, only 9 of them knew that happened. And in that whole room, only 10 of them knew. Joseph and 9 other brothers. Reuben and Benjamin didn't know that information. This is the first that they're hearing about it. So it is really a deep, deep secret that only Joseph would know. And why would anyone else ever claim to be that person who was betrayed and sold into slavery? So after confirming his identity and revealing that They are guilty. What does Joseph do? Verse 5, he says, now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. He comforts them. Don't be grieved. Don't be hurt. Don't be distressed. And don't be angry with yourselves. And don't burn with anger towards one another. Don't blame one another. Remember, we already saw Reuben blame them, right? I told you not to do that. We already heard that earlier. And that would be the natural reaction, to blame one another. Don't blame one another. Don't be angry. Well, why not? It's because Joseph sees God's hand in sending him to Egypt for a greater purpose. God doesn't make mistakes. Remember, if they'd done something else, something different, they and countless others would be in a much more dire situation. Would be in greater trouble given the 7 years of famine. Now, this is not an excuse for their guilt. He's not excusing them of their guilt. They are guilty. They did wrong. But if Joseph is focusing on a higher purpose for suffering. And Joseph's suffering, it had meaning. And it was worth it. The effects and the outcome, where God has orchestrated it, was worth it. It's meaningless suffering that is unbearable. That's not what we see here. And notice the tension here between a human's responsibility and God's sovereignty. It says, you sold me here because you sold me here, for God sent me. You sold me, but God sent. Now we see here God's sovereign plan and direction. And he does that. He brings that about, his direction and his plan, through people. Even sinful people. Even wickedness. God brings about good things. Brings about life. Even through their wickedness. Now notice, God's plan, his sovereignty, it's not generic. It says, now, do not be grieved or angry with yourself, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you. His plan was not just generic. It had a specific purpose and object, which is his people, that family, the family of Jacob, the one in whom God had a covenant relationship. He was faithful to them even before they knew it. So what does that mean? And God sent him there to preserve life. What does that mean? Well, Joseph goes on to explain that. Verse 6, he says, for the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will still have 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, verse 6 simply says that the famine is very serious after 2 years, and it's going to continue 5 more years. That's information the brothers don't know. That was Pharaoh's dream, but that wasn't revealed to the brothers. They didn't know how long it was going to last. This is new information for them. And when it says there'll be neither plowing nor harvest, that's a figure of speech. It's often used in the Old Testament where it talks about the beginning and the end, and thus everything in between. And it's just simply communicating there's going to be no growth in crops. We may say from head to toe, and thus imply to everything in between. And with the words, God sent me before you, we see a repetition in the phrase. It's exact in Hebrew. It is emphasizing that what I said earlier as far as preserving life, now I'm going to define it for you. He defines it in 2 ways. He explains it 2 ways. Number 1, to preserve a remnant. A remnant is a part of something that's a whole or a greater number in the earth. Now this word for earth is actually, it's eret in Hebrew, which can mean earth, but it also can mean land. And I want to suggest to you that I think this really should be translated land here, because he's specifically talking about the land of Canaan. And what he's saying is that your families are going to continue. God sent me before you in order to provide this so that your families, the family of Jacob, the house of Israel, will continue. And that we will be able to have a remnant in the land, a place in the land. Now, when it says a remnant, preserve you, a remnant in the earth or the land, if there's a remnant, it implies that others don't make it. It implies that there's others that can't afford it, and they will die or be sold into slavery. Now, it's better to take it as land rather than earth, because as far as we know, Joseph preserved everyone in Egypt, right? That was part of God's revelation. So there's no remnant there, but there would be a remnant in those from Canaan, the land of Canaan. So that's the first one, to preserve a remnant or a part in the land of Canaan, from the land of Canaan, which is you, Israel, is going to be kept alive. And the second one is, he says, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. This focuses on God saving them from starvation in a miraculous manner, to be a witness of his loving kindness towards his people. Now, this is a miracle of design and of sovereign outworking, because no one could have planned all these details to bring that to an end except for God. There's no way any man could have done that. But it just shows how God is providing for his people. Now, before we go on, this whole situation brings up an important question, which I know a few of you are asking, which is, well, wasn't God in control of the famine in the first place? The answer is, yes, he was. So, how do we answer that? In all likelihood, the famine was a judgment on the people of Canaan for their wickedness, their rebellion, and their sin against God, and his reality, the reality of his presence, and the witness that Jacob and his whole family and Isaac were of all the people, of who God was. And that is hinted at and applied when the text says that there's a remnant in that land that's left. The rest are judged. So, in the midst of that judgment, God protects, God provides, and God guides his people. So, Joseph then concludes with verse 8, where it says, now therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. So here he's saying that God's will, opposed to man's, not man's, is the controlling factor in the events of life. Therefore, he bears no animosity towards them. He forgives them. And Joseph reveals his faith in the truth that God is sovereign in all circumstances of his life, and that God is bringing about a greater good. This is parallel to Romans 8:28, which says that we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And we can see this in Joseph's life. That he knows, and thus he's a testimony to witness for us, that God causes all things to work together. Not that everything was good. Being sold into slavery, not good. Being put in shackles in prison, not good. Being falsely accused, go right down the list. These are not good things, but they work together for a greater good. And if, for those who love God, we see Joseph's character as one who is faithful out of love for God, and to those who are called according to his purpose. Those are one and the same. It's just looking at it from two different perspectives. From a human perspective, Joseph loved God. From God's perspective, he was chosen out to bring about this purpose and this task. So we can see the events that Joseph went through while he remained faithful to God, while he was loving him. That gave him the specific and unique experiences that made him the man that he needed to be in order to fulfill God's specific purposes for him. Which he goes on to say, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord of all his household, and a ruler over all the land of Egypt. So he gives three descriptions of himself here. Number one is the father of Pharaoh. Now this is a well-attested phrase in ancient Egyptian literature. It refers to a variety of offices or priests who had an advisory role to Pharaoh. And thus he's giving him guidance like a father gives a child guidance. And so he has that advisor relationship. And then he says he's the lord of all his household. That means that Joseph has total control of state affairs in the treasury. And then the rule over all the land of Egypt, it simply saying that he has equal power to Pharaoh. So it's fascinating here because this specifically, talking about the rule. The brothers at one time balked at Joseph's dream and objected and said, "Would you really going to rule and reign over us?" Yes. Because God said it. And God brought it back. And I bet you at this circumstances, they were certainly glad that he is ruling over them now. Now, before I move on, I want to address another subject that this text brings up. They may be asking, which is, how do we know when circumstances of life are directions from God or attacks from the evil one? To answer this, I have two answers. The first one is, there are no attacks from the evil one that are outside of the sovereign plan of God. God is greater and can bring about his glory through it. And the greatest example is of Christ. Acts 2:22, it says, "Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God." Predetermined plan, foreknowledge. This is already done in God's plan. You nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. God's plan, you did it. You're responsible, but this is God's predetermined plan. It is not an either or. It's a both and. How do we know the circumstances of life are directions for God or attacks from the evil one? There are no such thing as attacks from the evil one that are outside of God's control or direction. Now, putting an innocent man to death is an evil. It's not from the kingdom of God, it's from the kingdom of Satan. So although God allowed Jesus to be attacked, he is wiser and greater, and he brought about life, beauty, and grace. And in Jesus' obedience, even unto the cross, that was, because he loved God, it was an ultimate example of glorification, of where Christ ultimately glorified God in his actions. Because his love for the Father was greater than anything. And thus, he became a powerful witness. Same thing is true in Joseph. Through all his troubles, Joseph was faithful. And he was a powerful witness for God in the circumstances. So that's answer number one. It's not an either or. Answer number two is, when we're looking at the circumstances in our life, number one, do our circumstances tempt us to do something sinful? To act out? Or do our circumstances make it more difficult for us to do what we were commanded to do? Sin of action, sin of omission. Now, notice I said, I didn't say prevent us from doing what we're commanded to do, because, sometimes let me rephrase that. There are always so many things that we can do. There are so many good things, good ministries, good acts. We don't have time to. We don't have the resources to. There's not enough hours in the day. And we have to be directed by God what one thing to do opposed to the other. We can't do it all. But if we're going in one direction and we see there's circumstances that are making it more difficult for us to do that, which we're trying to be obedient to God in, that very well could be an attack. So, in conclusion, the reality looks like this. Everything is in the control of God. Circumstances of our life, which is for our good. But sometimes God uses attacks. They're allowed by the evil one in order to bring about our faith, witness, and a greater glory. Think about the temptations of Christ. God was in control of the circumstances from his birth to his ascension. But during that time, God allowed attacks from others in order to demonstrate his obedience, demonstrate his faith, demonstrate his love, his mercy, his grace, and godliness. Okay, let's go back to the text and read about the third truth that's uncovered which is the instructions to bring Jacob to Egypt. Now, this third truth reveals Joseph's desperate desire to be reunited and to take care of his father. Bring a blessing to him and joy to him, not sorrow, which he didn't realize he was doing by bringing Benjamin down. So this begins with verses 9 through 11, where he invites Jacob down. So we see an invitation from Joseph. Verse 9 starts off by saying, "Hurry, go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph.'" And you can see a sense of urgency and excitement in Joseph's words here. In his invitation, Joseph then uses 3 lines of argumentation to try to coax his father to move. Because you can imagine when people are settled someplace for years, we're talking about over 20 years, it's probably 23 years, they're not going to just up and go, up and move. So Joseph is pleading with him, trying to build the strongest case, and he gives 3 reasons. The first one is, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. So the first argument that Joseph gives is that God has made him an authority in Egypt. Now that's fascinating because the first words he says to his father is words about God. God has done this. The first thing he shares is something about their common faith. Something that they both value and see that as important. It's something that unifies them. And because God has done it, he's sharing how God has fulfilled the promise that he made in his dream. And thus what he's saying is, me being in Egypt, that's God's will. That's the dream that he told me about. That's why you need to come down and join me in God's will. And secondarily, on a side note, because he is the Lord of Egypt, he has rule here. And this is implied by this, but the text is really focusing on God's will here. But if Jacob stays in Canaan, and Joseph just continues to send food to him, when there's a land in a region that doesn't have food, is in a great famine, and there's great desperation and need, and then, oh, by the way, there's a family there, relatively small, has an abundance of food, what do they become? A target. And Joseph can't protect them. But Joseph is the Lord of all of Egypt. So they can move anywhere in Egypt and be protected. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that Joseph he has a desire to share life. He says, "You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me. You and your children and your children's children and your flocks and your herds and all that you have." Now, the exact location of Goshen is unknown. It's not found in any ancient documents, the name Goshen. But later on in Genesis, it says the land of Ramses, which is probably parallel. So this is probably referring to a region of the eastern part of the delta. It is land that is normally has great pastures. Not right now because there's 2 years of famine going on, but normally it's great land for pasturing. So it would fit very well. And notice Joseph says, "You shall live here," so you can still have a place for your herds, and you can still live the kind of life that you're living, but you'll be near me. I'll be able to be a part of your life. I'll have a relationship. And it's not just him, but also your children. That means his brothers. I'll be a part of my brother's lives. And your children's children, which means the nieces and nephews. But he words this all from Jacob's perspective, because he's removing any excuse that Jacob might give. Oh, I can't move because Reuben still lives here, or my grandbabies are still here. No, you're all coming down. So then he also lists flocks, which is sheep and goats, and then herds, which is cattle. All of his possessions. They'll be fine. Bring them all down. You're not losing anything, except you're changing locations. And then all that you have, catchphrase. There's no excuse for you to not to come. Bring it all. And third, Joseph gives the argument that he wants to provide, especially for the next 5 years. He says, there, if you move to Goshen, I will also provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come. You and your household and all that you have will be impoverished. So Joseph can provide for the whole family if they move to Goshen, especially during the next 5 years of the famine. And if they do not, if Jacob doesn't, he and all the families under him, they will be impoverished. What that means is to be made poor. Now, what does that mean? Well, if there's no grain, they have to buy it. So their herds and their flocks will die without grain. They will have to sell them. And in that time, herds and flocks, that's money. And they will have to sell their possessions for food. And if it gets bad enough, they'll have to sell their children into slavery. And if it gets worse, they'll have to sell themselves into slavery. And then they will be surely to the bottom of being impoverished. That's what he means. That's the direction in which their life will be if they stay there. So he says, come down. So what do we see in these three arguments? We see Joseph being an honorable man who wants to take care of his father in his old age. Now, in addition to this invitation, Joseph wants his father to hear the testimony from the brothers. Verse 12 and 13 said, behold, he's talking to his brother, behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth which is speaking to you. Now, you must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt, and all that you have seen. And you must hurry and bring my father down here. So when he says, my mouth which speaks to you, he's speaking Hebrew. Remember, this whole time he's been using an interpreter. So now he's speaking them face to face directly. I'm Joseph, and I'm going to prove it again, because now you can see I'm speaking Hebrew. I'm speaking to you directly. And you see with your own eyes, and they're to share everything that they've seen with their father. When it says the splendor in Egypt, it means all the glory of Egypt. Remember, they're living in tents in Canaan, and here are huge cities. Remember, the Sphinx is already 500 years old. So you can see the grand pyramids and temples and things that are in Egypt. And he's in the capital, or in other huge cities, because he's the second of all of Egypt. So tell them about all the great things that you see here. And notice he singles out Benjamin. I mean, your all eyes see it, but also Benjamin. Why is that? Well, probably two reasons. Number one, the other brothers have already lied to their father, right? And Benjamin hasn't. But number two, Benjamin's the favorite. If Benjamin wants to go, well, he'd have a better chance of twisting his father's arm. He would have more sway. And then again, he says at the end, you must hurry. You see, again, it's a repetition. The same word used in verse 9. It shows his great desire, his great excitement to bring and be reunited with his father. So finally, now we're coming to the reaction of the brothers of Joseph, verse 14 and 15. This is the fourth truth uncovered, which pictures the joys and wholeness of reconciliation. The text says, then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept on them. And afterwards his brothers talked with him. The text emphasizes that the two full brothers, their emotional reunion was filled with tears of joy. Now this was probably more emotional for Benjamin, because Benjamin had always thought his brother was dead. But now he's alive, and he has a brother. So they wept loudly. And remember, that word for weeping is the same word that was in verse 2. So this, from verse 14 to 15, is the weeping that the Egyptians heard. Weeping, what they heard outside. These are tears of joy. Why? Because a reconciled family is what we were designed to have. A family at peace and harmony together. This is our best. And they're coming to it. They're coming to realize that truth. And also, verse 15 says that he kissed them all, his brothers. He kissed them on the cheek as a sign of acceptance, of welcome, of reconciliation. It's a family now. And what does it look like to be reconciled? What happens afterwards? They talk. They relate. They share life. They have many years to catch up on. And now they can speak freely to each other as brothers. Now the talking there is in contrast to earlier in chapter 37, where it says that the brothers saw that their father loved him more than the other brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. You can see that great reversal has finally come, and now they can talk with him. So the family division is now being mended. And we see here Jacob's prayer. El Shaddai did grant compassion, mercy, and love in the sight of Joseph so that he would release himself to his brothers. And that, no, indeed, he's not bereaved of a child. So we see a complete reconciliation. And that gives us a pattern. The pattern is, number one, the offense. The brothers acted wickedly towards Joseph. There's no question there. And they removed him from their lives. And Joseph experienced suffering. You can see a pattern there, or a greater principle of offense. But we see also Joseph has to forgive his brothers. He does forgive them. Then they repent from their former actions. Now, they unknowingly confess, but they do confess as such to Joseph. And they demonstrate lives that are different. That's true repentance. Number three, we see Joseph then, it's not good enough just to forgive. He has to do more. He has to receive them. Joseph then needed to take the next step towards restoring the relationship. And he does it by privately taking away his disguise, comforting their concerning over his hostility, and embracing them as brothers. That's an important step, that he's the one that's hurt, and he has to make himself vulnerable again. And then finally, that's where reconciliation happens. And it's demonstrated in their conversations, in their sharing of life. And that is what God has called us to. Okay, let's move to applications and major points of this section. Number one, when Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers, he is in a place of authority and advantage. Joseph uses his position to speak comforting words that will bring peace and reminds his repentant brothers of God's sovereign hand. In our relationships with God's people, especially when we have been wronged, but there's repentance, let us be peacemakers that speak words of comfort and healing. Number two, Joseph shares that God had a greater purpose for his suffering. From Romans 8:28, all believers know that the circumstances of their lives are also being worked out in a marvelous design by the sovereign hand of God for our good and for the greater purpose of his glory. God does not make mistakes. We might not understand why, but we know, trust, and love the God who does. Find comfort and peace in his direction. Number three, Joseph understood that God had brought him into various situations to shape his life so that he could uniquely fit God's purposes. How has God uniquely shaped your life, your experiences, and how can that be used in serving his kingdom? And don't necessarily think of grandiose things. Think of everyday things, the gifts that you have, the wisdom that you have, and how you can impact others' lives. There's no, going back to the principle of the feeding of the 5,000, small gifts can do much. Number four, Joseph shows his honorable qualities and his great desire to reconnect with and provide for his father. He does not want any harm or sorrow to come to him, but instead wants to bring peace and joy to his remaining years. And that's something that's honorable we all need to emulate. Then number five, Joseph had to let his brothers into his life in order to receive the joy and wholeness of reconciliation. This brought tears of happiness and relief because a family in peace is God's design for our best. It's what we really want, whether we know it or not. The model of reconciliation in Joseph's life is the offense, the forgiveness, repentance, confession, receiving, and then shared life. In our broken relationships, we must adopt and implement our parts in these steps towards reconciliation and peace. And finally, Jacob had prayed that El Shaddai would grant his sons compassion from the Egyptian ruler and that his two sons would be released. God answered his prayer in even a greater fashion, as Joseph is also now released to him. The point is, God answers prayers. Is there anything else you want to add? Questions you want to ask?
I think another reason that Joseph told